The world held its breath, eyes glued to screens, as the charismatic leader stepped onto the immense global stage. His smile was warm, reassuring, almost impossibly perfect. He spoke of unity, of a new era of peace, a time when old divisions would crumble under the weight of shared humanity. His words, delivered with a captivating blend of passion and logic, promised an end to strife, a fresh start for every nation. He wasn't just a politician, he was a phenomenon, a beacon of hope shining brightly in a world desperate for light. Yet as he unveiled his grand peace initiative, a plan designed to knit together every corner of the planet, a subtle shift occurred. He spoke of universal justice, but his definition subtly chipped away at long-held moral truths, suggesting that some principles once considered absolute were merely outdated relics. With disarming charm, he presented his vision, a framework for global harmony that he argued required a collective abandonment of what he termed divisive spiritual dogma. He wasn't overtly attacking any faith, no, his approach was far more insidious. He simply reframed core spiritual principles as obstacles to true peace, suggesting a new, more inclusive spirituality that embraced everything while truly standing for nothing. A chilling sense of unease began to spread, a cold dread that touched those who understood the deeper implications. They saw past the polished words and the dazzling smile, recognizing the subtle erosion of foundations they believed immutable. From the quiet corners of the spiritual wilderness, a voice emerged. It wasn't loud or filled with outrage, but rather a quiet, determined whisper of calculated discernment. This voice belonged to the narrator, a solitary figure who had spent years poring over ancient texts, recognizing patterns that stretched back millennia. The leader's speech, so universally praised, resonated with an unsettling familiarity. It wasn't just politics unfolding on the global stage, it was prophecy, meticulously documented in faded scrolls and forgotten verses, now playing out before a mesmerized world. The realization was heavy, undeniable. This wasn't merely a charismatic politician. This was the beginning of something far greater, far more significant than anyone dared to imagine. The immediate consequences were subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but they were there nonetheless. A quiet fracturing of global alliances began. Some nations, eager for the promised peace and prosperity, embraced the new paradigm with open arms, eager to shed what they saw as the burdens of tradition. Others, however, resisted, their leaders sensing the dangerous undertones, the hidden cost of such universal harmony. A short, poignant phrase began to whisper through certain circles, a somber truth that cut through the manufactured optimism. Not all peace is divine. It was a warning, a lament, and a declaration. The global stage was now set, the line subtly drawn between those who embraced the new vision and those who clung to ancient truths. The true battle, unseen by most, had just begun. The world was teetering on a precipice, unaware of the spiritual war that was now inevitable, a war for the very soul of humanity. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. To truly grasp the gravity of this unfolding drama, we must journey back, far beyond the polished screens and modern rhetoric, into the sun-baked lands where these prophecies first took root. Imagine the ancient Middle East, a crucible of empires and faiths, where the very dust underfoot seemed to whisper tales of old. Here, amidst the bustling markets filled with the scent of spices and the drone of countless tongues, and out in the stark, silent desert landscapes, men and women grappled with the mysteries of the divine. They inscribed their insights onto fragile papyrus and heavy parchment, creating the dusty scrolls that would eventually become the bedrock of our understanding. These were not just historical documents, they were urgent messages, penned by those who saw beyond their own lifetimes, warning future generations of trials and triumphs to come. The lives of these ancient sages and prophets were not easy. They were not cloistered academics, but often men and women who faced ridicule, persecution, and even death for their adherence to what they believed was divine truth. Picture them, hunched over flickering oil lamps, their faces etched with the strain of deep thought, their minds wrestling with complex visions and cryptic messages. They dedicated their entire existence to understanding these divine communications, seeking patterns, deciphering symbols, and piecing together a grand narrative that spanned centuries. Their unwavering faith was a shield against the skepticism of their contemporaries, their hope for a righteous future, a beacon in times of despair. They spoke of a coming Messiah, a Redeemer who would set things right, but intertwined with that hope was also the solemn warning of an ultimate evil, a deceiver who would rise to challenge the very fabric of truth. These ancient seers, like us, were vulnerable. They longed for peace, for a world free from suffering and injustice. They understood the human tendency towards deception, the ease with which people could be swayed by charismatic figures promising easy answers. Their dreams were not merely for personal salvation, but for a world transformed by divine truth, a society living in harmony with cosmic law. This vision fueled their relentless vigilance against false saviors, against anyone who would claim divine authority but lead humanity astray. They knew that the greatest threats often came disguised as blessings, that the wolf could wear the sheep's clothing with convincing skill. They documented these fears, these hopes, and these warnings with meticulous care, understanding that the stakes were nothing less than the soul of humanity. Woven into the very fabric of these prophecies, subtle yet persistent, were the ancient whispers of a coming deceiver. The idea of an Antichrist was not a sudden dramatic invention. It was a concept that evolved over millennia, a carefully documented warning built upon countless observations of human nature and divine revelation. From the earliest texts, there were references to figures who would oppose the divine, who would challenge truth, and who would seek to usurp the place of the true Redeemer. These were not abstract theological concepts. They were practical warnings designed to shape the spiritual landscape, preparing generations for the ultimate test of discernment. The prophets saw history not as a random series of events, but as an unfolding drama with specific characters and archetypes destined to appear at crucial junctures. Their words, preserved through the ages, now stand as a testament to their foresight, offering a lens through which we can understand the present moment, recognizing the ancient shadow of the antagonist in the seemingly modern guise of the charismatic leader. The ancient warnings, meticulously documented by scholars and prophets, were often lost in the noise of daily life, swallowed by human failings. There were countless moments when humanity, swayed by worldly desires or fear, compromised divine truths, creating cracks in the spiritual foundation. These weren't sudden dramatic collapses, but slow, insidious erosions, accumulating over centuries. Think of the historical misinterpretations that distorted clear messages, the spiritual complacency that allowed essential vigilance to wane. Each time a generation chose comfort over conviction or popularity over principle, another brick was removed from the wall of discernment. These cracks, barely visible at first, became the perfect pathways for deception to creep in, making the present global willingness to accept a seemingly benevolent but ultimately deceptive leader not an accident, but the culmination of this long, slow spiritual drift. History is littered with broken promises, with instances where leaders, cloaked in the mantle of divine authority, led their followers astray. These were not always malicious acts from the outset. Sometimes they began with good intentions, but greed, power, or fear warped the original vision. Religious figures, kings, emperors, all have at various times claimed a special connection to the divine, only to then demand blind obedience, suppress critical thought, and twist sacred texts to serve their own agendas. These historical precedents, these repeated patterns of manipulation and betrayal, mirrored precisely the seductive tactics foretold for the end times. Each instance chipped away at public trust, making it harder for people to distinguish genuine spiritual guidance from self-serving rhetoric. The collective memory of these deceptions, even if subconscious, created a fertile ground for a future manipulator who could exploit this inherited cynicism and yearning for a strong, decisive figure. Over time, faith and truth have been subjected to veiled humiliations, subtle dismissals that undermine their authority without outright banning them. Think of how spiritual insights were gradually relegated to the realm of personal opinion, how ancient wisdom was rebranded as mere folklore, or how moral absolutes were relabeled as outdated dogma. These weren't violent persecutions, but rather a quiet marginalization, a societal shrug that implied, this isn't really important anymore. When genuine discernment is subtly mocked or dismissed as naive, It creates an environment where people become less equipped to identify true deception. The voices of reason, the dissenting voices who dared to uphold unpopular truths, were often ridiculed, painted as extremists or out of touch. This constant chipping away at the value of spiritual vigilance prepared the cultural landscape for a time when a charismatic leader could easily dismiss ancient warnings as irrelevant, appealing instead to a more enlightened and modern worldview. The control of narratives and the suppression of dissenting spiritual voices have been powerful tools throughout history. Power structures, whether political or religious, have often used societal pressures to maintain their grip, to ensure conformity. Those who dared to challenge the prevailing wisdom, who spoke uncomfortable truths, often faced severe consequences, from social ostracism to economic ruin. This manipulation ensured that certain ideas thrived while others withered under the weight of disapproval. Propaganda, censorship, and the careful shaping of public opinion have always been effective in guiding the masses, even when those masses believed they were thinking for themselves. This historical precedent of controlling information and suppressing alternative perspectives laid the groundwork for a supreme manipulator, one who could harness global communication to craft an irresistible narrative, silencing opposition with unprecedented efficiency. The stage was being set, brick by brick, for a figure who could not only control governments, but also the very thoughts and beliefs of billions. The understanding that the current global willingness to accept a seemingly benevolent, but ultimately deceptive leader is not an accident, but the culmination of centuries of spiritual drift and compromise, is crucial. It's the last straw in a long series of choices. Each generation, facing its own challenges, has made decisions that, however small, contributed to this collective vulnerability. The slow erosion of faith, the increasing reliance on human wisdom over divine revelation, the growing comfort with moral relativism, all these factors have converged. We are not just witnessing a new phenomenon, we are seeing the inevitable outcome of a historical trajectory, a spiritual debt coming due. The world, having systematically dismantled its defenses against deception, is now ripe for the grandest deception of all. The ancient warnings, once dismissed as relics of a bygone era, now echo with chilling clarity, revealing a pattern that has been meticulously woven through the tapestry of human history, leading directly to this moment. The world, already weakened by centuries of spiritual drift, began to fracture more violently. A period of unprecedented global crises swept across the planet, shaking every nation to its core. Economic systems, once thought unshakable, buckled and collapsed, sending shockwaves of poverty and despair through communities. Widespread conflicts erupted, not just between traditional adversaries, but within nations themselves, tearing apart the social fabric. Natural disasters, more frequent and more devastating than ever before, added another layer of suffering, leaving millions displaced and vulnerable. This chaotic environment created the perfect fertile ground for a powerful, unifying figure to emerge, someone who promised order amidst the turmoil. Nations, once bound by treaties and shared interests, now turned against each other with alarming speed. Traditional alliances, painstakingly built over decades, crumbled under the weight of self-preservation and mutual suspicion. The language of diplomacy was replaced by the rhetoric of blame, and borders that had once been permeable became hard lines of division. A pervasive sense of fear and desperation gripped humanity, a primal need for security that overshadowed all other concerns. People yearned for a strong hand, a clear voice, someone to cut through the confusion and offer a path forward no matter the cost. This widespread vulnerability was a canvas upon which the charismatic leader could paint a new vision, one that seemed to offer salvation. As the global situation worsened, social pressures mounted, intensifying the demand for conformity to new global ideologies. The need for unity, for a singular direction, became paramount in the public discourse. Dissenting voices, those who still clung to ancient truths or questioned the emerging narrative, found themselves facing increasing scrutiny and marginalization. Their concerns were dismissed as divisive, their warnings as fear-mongering, and their resistance as an impediment to progress. The media, largely controlled or influenced by the emerging power structures, amplified the message of global cooperation and painted any opposition as dangerous. The pressure to join the consensus, to embrace the new way of thinking, became almost unbearable, especially for those who watched their communities unravel around them. The charismatic leader, initially hailed as a savior, began to show a different side as power consolidated. The peace initiatives and global justice policies he had introduced subtly yet undeniably eroded individual freedoms. What started as voluntary cooperation soon became mandatory adherence. Regulations presented as necessary for stability began to challenge deeply held beliefs, particularly those rooted in spiritual traditions. All these changes were implemented under the guise of maintaining order and securing peace, making it difficult for many to object without appearing to be proponents of chaos. The gentle persuasion of the early days gave way to a more assertive, almost authoritarian tone. His words, once soothing, now carried an implicit threat for those who would not fall in line. Those who clung to ancient truths felt the weight of judgment from every direction. Ostracization became a daily reality. Neighbors who had once been friends now looked at them with suspicion, their eyes reflecting the dominant narrative. Family members, swayed by the promise of security and a return to normalcy, urged them to conform, unable to comprehend their resistance. Colleagues at work whispered behind their backs, fearing that association with such outdated views might jeopardize their own positions. This was the moment of greatest emotional suffocation, a period when the pressure to abandon one's convictions was immense. The world seemed to be moving in one direction, and those who stood against the tide felt isolated, alone, and profoundly misunderstood. This intense period of spiritual and emotional hardship was the crucible before the inevitable spiritual rebellion, a test of faith that would reveal the true strength of their convictions. The ground was being prepared for a confrontation, not just of ideologies, but of spirits. The lines were drawn not on maps, but in the hearts of humanity. Then, a cataclysmic event occurred, ripping through the carefully constructed illusion. It wasn't a single natural disaster, nor an economic collapse, but a combination of both, engineered with a precision that was chilling. The global economic system, meticulously restructured and centralized under the charismatic leader's authority, suddenly imploded. It wasn't a slow decline, it was an instantaneous digital erasure of wealth, affecting billions. Markets crashed, currencies vanished, and the digital infrastructure that held the new world order together fragmented into chaos. But this was no accident. Simultaneously, a series of coordinated cyber attacks, far more sophisticated than anything seen before, targeted critical infrastructure globally: communication networks, power grids, and even supply chains. The world was plunged into a technological dark age, a stark contrast to the promised utopia. This devastating revelation shattered the facade. The charismatic leader, in a desperate attempt to regain control, delivered a global address. His words, once smooth and reassuring, were now laced with venom. He didn't offer solutions, he offered blame, directing it squarely at those who had resisted his system, calling them saboteurs of peace and enemies of unity. Then came the undeniable act of blasphemy. He declared himself the sole source of truth and order, demanding absolute fealty, proclaiming that only through him could humanity find salvation. He openly mocked ancient spiritual texts, burning symbolic copies on live global feeds, declaring them outdated fables that had hindered human progress. It was a brazen, malevolent act, revealing the true force behind the benevolent mask. The malevolent force, long suspected by a few, was now undeniable, raw, and terrifyingly real. The quiet, discerning voices, once marginalized and ridiculed, now rose with undeniable conviction. The narrator, having meticulously studied the ancient prophecies, knew this was the moment. The digital chaos had ironically created a space for truth to emerge. With global communication systems down, small, localized networks began to form, relying on older, more resilient technologies and word of mouth. Through these nascent networks, the narrator and a growing collective of dissenting voices began to present irrefutable evidence. They shared interpretations of ancient texts that precisely foretold these events: the rise of a false messiah, the consolidation of power, the economic collapse, and the ultimate blasphemy. They showed how every step of the charismatic leader's ascent, every policy, every crisis, aligned perfectly with warnings penned millennia ago. The evidence was overwhelming, exposing the deceiver not just as a power-hungry tyrant, but as the very embodiment of ancient evil. The charismatic leader, his mask of benevolence completely stripped away, unleashed unprecedented persecution. With the global economic system in ruins and the populace in terror, he declared martial law, establishing a brutal centralized authority. Those who refused to conform, those who clung to the ancient truths and resisted his blasphemous claims, were rounded up with ruthless efficiency. Camps were established, not for re-education, but for systematic eradication. He enforced a new global identification system, a mark without which no one could buy, sell, or participate in society. This was the ultimate revealing of his Antichrist nature, a figure not just opposed to spiritual truth, but actively seeking to crush it, to replace divine authority with his own. The world witnessed the full horror of a leader who had promised peace, now delivering unparalleled tyranny. Yet amidst the terror and despair, an unexpected opportunity arose. The very collapse of the digital world, the breakdown of the all-encompassing surveillance, created a window of clarity for many. No longer bombarded by constant propaganda, no longer reliant on the system for their every need, people began to think for themselves. The undeniable fulfillment of ancient prophecies, shared by the dissenting voices, resonated deeply with those who had felt a vague unease all along. The stark reality of the charismatic leader's tyranny forced a choice: submit to an obvious evil, or embrace a truth that offered no easy path, but promised ultimate freedom. This moment, born from catastrophe, broke the cycle of suffering for many, shifting the narrative towards a definitive confrontation. The battle for allegiance was no longer subtle, it was laid bare, demanding a conscious, profound decision from every individual. The world plunged into an agonizing chaos as the revelation of the Antichrist's true nature tore through societies. The narrator, representing the faithful, found themselves at the epicenter of this storm, facing not just persecution, but a deluge of fear and emotional turmoil. The once subtle pressure to conform had morphed into an overt, brutal campaign of eradication. Every day brought new threats, new losses, new reasons to despair. Yet, within this crucible of suffering, their resolve hardened, fueled by the undeniable truth of the prophecies now unfolding before their eyes. The psychological impact was profound and widespread, affecting everyone from the highest echelons of power to the most remote villages. Many who had initially followed the deceptive leader, seduced by his promises of peace and prosperity, now grappled with a profound sense of regret and shame. The digital erasure of wealth, the coordinated cyber attacks, and particularly the leader's brazen act of blasphemy and subsequent tyranny, had stripped away their illusions. They saw their complicity, their eager embrace of what seemed like salvation, and the bitter taste of betrayal filled their mouths. This realization sparked a global outpouring of grief, anger, and a desperate spiritual awakening. People confronted the harsh reality of their choices, the devastating consequences of placing their trust in a false promise. The world echoed with the lamentations of those who had been deceived, a collective cry of anguish for lost innocence and shattered hopes. Amidst this widespread despair, allies began to emerge from the most unexpected places. Individuals and groups who had secretly held on to ancient truths, often in quiet defiance, now openly supported the resistance. These were the dissenting voices who had been marginalized, ridiculed, and threatened, but whose faith had never wavered. They formed networks, small pockets of resilience, using ingenuity and courage to bypass the Antichrist's surveillance and control. Their actions, often at great personal risk, provided glimmers of hope in the encroaching darkness. They shared resources, protected the vulnerable, and most importantly, continued to spread the message of truth, reinforcing the narrator's efforts. Their quiet rebellion became a beacon for others, showing that resistance was not only possible, but necessary. Conversely, others, hardened by deception and fear, became fierce adversaries. These were individuals who, despite the overwhelming evidence of the Antichrist's malevolence, clung to the remnants of the old system, either out of terror a desperate hope for a return to normalcy, or a twisted belief that the Antichrist's iron-fisted rule was the only way to restore order. They actively collaborated with the regime, turning on their neighbors, betraying those who sought to resist, and enforcing the Antichrist's tyrannical decrees. Their actions further deepened the schism in society, creating a landscape where trust was a luxury and suspicion a survival instinct. The world became a battleground, not just physically, but morally and spiritually. The cultural and religious landscapes of various nations dictated how people responded to this unprecedented crisis. In some regions, deeply rooted spiritual traditions fostered a spirit of martyrdom, with individuals bravely facing persecution, finding strength in their faith even unto death. In other areas, where historical experiences had taught the value of strategic retreat, people fled, seeking refuge in remote, untouched corners of the earth, forming new communities based on shared spiritual convictions. And in still others, a more active, organized resistance began to form, fighting back against the Antichrist's forces with whatever means they could muster. Each cultural response, shaped by unique historical and spiritual contexts, contributed to the complex tapestry of global resistance. The psychological impact was profound and widespread, touching every soul on the planet. The world was no longer just a collection of nations, but a fractured entity, united only by the universal struggle against an undeniable evil. The lines were drawn, and every individual was forced to choose a side, a choice that carried eternal weight. Amidst the crushing tribulation, against a backdrop of ruin and despair, pockets of resistance began to coalesce, growing with an unwavering faith that defied the overwhelming darkness. The narrator, having endured immense suffering, having witnessed both the depths of human depravity and the heights of spiritual courage, now stepped forward to lead the spiritual rebuilding. It was not a leadership of earthly power or military might, but one of quiet conviction, rooted in the clear understanding of prophetic fulfillment. They guided those who had survived, those who had seen through the deception, towards a renewed understanding of ancient truths, fostering communities built on resilience, mutual support, and an unshakable belief in divine justice. These were not easy times. The world remained scarred, but within these burgeoning communities a new hope, a purer faith began to blossom. The Antichrist's reign, for all its terror and apparent invincibility, was ultimately destined for defeat. This was not to be a victory won by human hands, though the resistance played its part in holding the line. Instead, it unfolded as a divine intervention, a powerful and undeniable act of justice that restored cosmic order. The prophecies meticulously documented by the sages and scholars spoke of a time when the heavens would open, when ultimate truth would descend to shatter the illusion of evil. And so it came to pass. In a blinding flash of light, an event unfathomable to human comprehension, the Antichrist's power was utterly broken. His tyrannical empire, built on lies and fear, crumbled in an instant, not by armies but by a force far greater, a force that had been promised since the dawn of time. The world watched, stunned, as the very fabric of reality seemed to shift, cleansing itself of the pervasive evil that had held it captive. The world was left irrevocably changed, a stark testament to the epical struggle it had just endured. Scarred the Antichrist's tyranny by the widespread suffering and betrayal, it was also purified, stripped bare of its former complacency and illusions. The narrative concluded with a profound sense of ultimate vindication for those who had remained faithful, for the dissenting voices and allies who had risked everything, and for the narrator who had guided them through the darkest night. Their steadfastness, their refusal to compromise on fundamental spiritual principles, was now revealed as the only path to true freedom. The justice was absolute, the restoration complete, leaving a world that, though forever marked by its past, was now infused with a deeper understanding of truth and discernment. The easy paths of superficial peace and worldly prosperity had proven to be snares, while the difficult road of unwavering faith had led to ultimate salvation. This journey, from the subtle whispers of deception to the roaring triumph of truth, served as a powerful summary of the enduring human struggle between light and darkness. It emphasized the critical importance of spiritual vigilance, the constant need to test every spirit, every charismatic leader, against the unyielding standard of ancient prophecies. The fulfillment of these prophecies, once dismissed by many, now stood as an undeniable testament to the meticulous plan unfolding across history. The message resonated not just as a historical account, but as an eternal hope that transcends even the darkest times. It reinforced the timeless relevance of understanding biblical warnings, not as relics of a bygone era, but as living guides for future generations. The lessons learned through unimaginable suffering were etched into the collective consciousness. True peace comes not from human promises, but from divine truth, and discernment is the shield against all deception. The path ahead was one of rebuilding, of healing, but also of a profound, unwavering commitment to the truths that had saved them all.